Hey everyone, David here with your weekly Mouthful of David video. Like usual, I'll give a quick update about the podcast. So we just dropped our most recent episode about Dunkirk, the 2017 Nolan movie, not the historical topic of Dunkirk. So give that a listen if you haven't already. We'll probably be doing a movie episode every 4 or 5 episodes or so. So just be on the lookout for those. Other than that, we'll be recording a new episode about the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, which was basically the pivotal battle for Vietnamese independence from the French during the 1950s. So, get ready for that. That should be pretty fun. We'll be recording that episode in a week and a half. And then after that, the episode should drop a week to 2 weeks after that. So, anyways, today I'm going to tackle the question of how does change happen in history, right? And before I get into the meat of the episode, I actually just started a memoir from a member of the IWW, also called the Wobblies, and they were they were a union from the early 1900s, but they weren't a union for a specific type of job or craft. They're called the Industrial Workers of the World, and they were an all-inclusive sort of big tent union that engaged in a lot of direct labor action. And so I just started it today, and I'm going to briefly read a couple snippets together from the introduction. This small book is written from memory. It is written entirely to remind the reader that no social changes, economic betterment, higher wages, improved working conditions, breaking down of prejudice, etc., were natural changes, but each and every one was a result of long and bitter struggle. I've written down here some recollections of my first 24 years at the center of activities to make possible some of the things we enjoy today. You may not agree with some of my conclusions and comments. Be that as it may, they are honest, and I came by them after 75 years of living close to this struggle. Every move to upset the apple cart of the status quo is a revolution. This is true whether the attempt be in little hamlets or in the largest industrial centers. In the early 1900s, any attempt to raise wages, better conditions, or shorten hours was revolution, whether it was attempted by the IWW, the AFL, or even the Brothers of Christian Endeavor. Much has been written about the IWW. Most that I have read has come from a very few of the top people like Bill Haywood and Ralph Chaplin. But let me make it plain, there would have been no IWW if it had depended on the Haywoods and Chaplins. To build the IWW took a different kind of person than Haywood and other well-known leaders. People like John Pansner, Walter T. Neff, Vincent St. John, Albert Prashner, Jack Law, Ted Frazier, Archie Sinclair, Whitey Klein. These are real names of real people, some still living. They are a few of the unsung hundreds that filled the jails in the free speech fights, who were on the picket lines along with their fellow workers in strikes from coast to coast. They were the ones who were beaten up, tarred, and feathered. Men like Lotcham from Oklahoma. You could tar and feather a man like Lotcham, but you couldn't break him. He would be right back in the fight the next day. There were hundreds like him. I knew most of them. Lone Wolf, Casey Jones, George Speed, Tom Whitehead, Bill Chance, Jimmy Ron, Joe Foley. My story is their story too. So when we talk about change, and this has been especially true over the last couple of decades, which is the time in which most of us have lived, and even for those of you who have lived longer, that's the majority of the time you've engaged in politics and paying attention to current events. An assumption that we make is that, voting is the most important form of democracy. And I'm definitely not telling anyone not to vote. But the thing is, you need direct action of some kind to also help get your point across, to make some sort of disruption, to make those in charge pay attention. And one of the, of course, most well-known examples is the civil rights movement, of course. But when we study the civil rights movement, We study the nonviolent marches, even in the face of violence from white supremacy. But then we kind of reach the, height of the non-peaceful and calm portion of everything. We look at the 1964 Civil Rights Act, we look at the 1965 Voting Rights Act, and we see that as the sort of zenith of it. But one thing that we don't talk about as much, or at least not generally, is that after MLK was assassinated in 1968, April 4th, there were riots all over the United States, but actually, especially in the North, right? Amongst black communities in the North predominantly. And the result of that, for as much hemming and hawing as there was from, everyone from white conservatives to moderates to liberals, on April 10th, the 1968 Civil Rights Act was passed. And that basically was about preventing discrimination in housing. And that's kind of an important piece of the puzzle here, because what really brings about change is, again, when you make those who are in power have to pay attention. And that's what direct action does. And different conditions and different, societal moods kind of determine a lot of those details, or at least influence them. But what's really important to understand is that voting alone is never enough. And unfortunately, that this would be a whole conversation, I think, for a podcast with Nick Cameron and I. But, I would argue that, the inability of the Obama administration to get super significant changes across stems in part from direct action to hold both Democrats and Republicans accountable. Again, another topic for another day, but just, kind of throwing that thought out there. But, going back to the IWW and also looking to labor as another example of direct action. I don't know how many of you are aware of this. A lot of people aren't, because it's not very well studied, especially not in K through 12. But labor organizing in the late 1800s and early 1900s was not like it is now, or like it was really just kind of, after World War II. Labor organizing during the late 1800s and early 1900s was basically workers going on strike, and then the bosses of the factories hiring private militias to battle workers, and also hiring detectives to basically do anything they could to undermine the workers. And workers had to be aware of that. I mean, in a lot of cases, it was almost like fighting a military battle, like a military campaign. And some of those militant actions influenced a lot of workers in a way that led to the creation of groups like the IWW. And, to go to the topic again of, civil rights and rights for Black Americans, the civil rights movement always had a component that I wouldn't even call violent so much as I would call, self-defense, basically, armed self-defense. And it doesn't get talked about as much, or it gets separated as completely distinct from the civil rights movement, which is not a very accurate drawing of things. Even MLK had armed guards outside of his home to make sure that he wouldn't get assassinated in the middle of the night. And so what I really want to emphasize with this video is the fact that, again, saying it for like the third time now, I think, I'm not telling anyone not to vote, but what's really important is, if there is nothing else other than the ballot box that shapes politics, then politicians can think to themselves that, I just have to be less shitty than my opponent, and people will have to vote for me out of a sort of sense of resignation and voting for the lesser of two evils, right? And, I mean, during the last few decades, that's kind of been the center of our politics, right? Like, this guy sucks, but he sucks less than the other guy. And we really need to reimagine that and change that. And I am very encouraged to see that, the movement for Black Lives, which obviously did not start this year, has been around since in its current form anyway, since 2013, 2014, and indirectly since the founding of this country. And you see all these other struggles, right? These struggles for workers' rights, women's rights, immigrants' rights, just different, all these different groups. And going back to the example of Obama, actually, one of the big examples of an exception to him not being able to get much done was him providing DACA for young undocumented people. And that came about because young undocumented people and their allies were some of the most organized people who pressured the Obama administration, as well as Democrats and Republicans more generally speaking, set that pressure and got that victory. And so this is just an important reminder to think of politics as a negotiation where the people, broadly speaking, really need to make themselves heard, right? And so if you can, go out to protests, go out to rallies, go out to marches, and if you can't, or if you just don't feel safe or comfortable doing so, do what you can to support different groups and different people who are taking a stand, because it's not just it's not just so that you can feel better about yourself. It's so that you can engage with politics in the way change actually happens, and it's going to empower you, and it's also going to teach you about how the world works. And I think it's a very invaluable lesson. So anyways, thank you for listening, everyone. Have a great week. Stay safe out there, and I'll catch you next time.